Good evening. It's good to see everybody tonight. We've been talking about the Exodus. I'm not going to do that tonight. I know some of you are planning an Exodus tomorrow, or to put it in another word, you're ready to depart on the morrow, so I thought we might not talk about the Exodus. I've made a New Year's resolution for myself not to preach as long as I have, but the New Year doesn't start until midnight. And so I put into one of these nifty tools that we've been learning at our teacher training, ready to depart on the morrow in midnight, and it popped up Acts 20 and verse 7 where it talked about Paul preaching until midnight. And since all of you are planning on going to the fellowship gathering anyways, I figured we could just stay here and I'll just keep talking. Riley, if you'll hand out the 2024 glasses that I've got. Just kidding. So 28 years ago tonight, at a pulpit 3.3 miles from here, there was a sermon given. And I can tell you that it was 28 years ago tonight because I was there. For you kids who may not remember this or may not have been alive for this, we used to have an annual New Year's Eve gathering. And that gathering would be, we'd get together and sing for about an hour, and it was an area-wide thing where other congregations would come and meet with us. We'd sing for about an hour, and then 2 or 3 guys would get up and give about a 20-minute talk. And on December 31st of 1995, there was a lesson entitled, Moving the Sticks in 96. Now, it was an odd topic, or an odd title, but it stuck with me. And I thought, 28 years later, I can't remember a single sermon that was given in the entirety of 1995, but I remember that sermon, and I remember the main points from that sermon. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't I try to do that? And so tonight, we're going to talk about opening a door in 24. Okay? So in doing that, we're going to talk about the story of Cornelius. And I asked Hugh on Wednesday night, what are you talking about? And he said, Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and life. And I thought, oh boy, I'm clear. And then he started talking about Cornelius. And I'll tell you, you can think of a kid getting an assignment with the rest of the class, and it comes the time to show off the presentation of their work. And I felt like my project was okay until Hugh started talking this morning, and now I'm kind of not wanting to share with the class what I've done. But we're going to talk about the story of Cornelius and this topic of opening a door in 24. So the first door that I want to talk about this evening is the door that Cornelius actually opened. And really there's 2 doors. I'm not going to charge you for the extra one tonight, but there's 2 doors that we'll talk about for Cornelius. So if you'll turn over to Acts chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. Acts chapter 10 and verse 1. It says here, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band, a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision evidently about the 9th hour of the day an angel of God coming in to him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodgeth with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do. And so this is the first knock on the door. The angel of the Lord comes to Cornelius in the 9th hour of the day. And I want you to think about what this must have been like for Cornelius. The angel of the Lord, he's afraid. He sees the angel of the Lord. And we see that being a common response for people who come into contact or see the angel of the Lord. He immediately says, What is it, Lord? He recognizes this angel as being a messenger from God. It's very similar to the reaction that we see from Saul. As he's on the road to Damascus, he sees this light, and he realizes immediately that this is the Lord. And so in verse 4, he is asking, what is it that you want me to do? And the angel of the Lord tells him to send men to Joppa. And so this is the first door that I want to talk about opening, this request of Cornelius to send men to Joppa. Now, Joppa is about 35 miles south of Caesarea, which is where Cornelius was. To put this into perspective, I looked on MapQuest, the distance from my house to NRG Stadium, which just happened to be 35 miles. You can look that up for yourself. It's the exact same distance between there and between Joppa and Caesarea. Now, if someone asked me to walk to NRG Stadium, on almost every day of the year, I would tell them, go fly a kite. I'm not walking to NRG Stadium. That's too far for me to walk. It's a dangerous trip. I'd have to walk over the Fred Hartman Bridge, which is dicey to begin with, or maybe I'd have to walk over the port bridge or do something like that, but it's 35 miles, and it would take me a day or two to get there. Now, next Monday night, if somebody said, hey, I've got a ticket to a football game, if you'll walk, I might think about it. I don't know that I'd walk, but I might think about it. You know, Cornelius could have said, no, that's too far. I'm not going to send these men 35 miles to go to Joppa. And I think if we put ourselves into the shoes of Cornelius, we might see some roadblocks that we put up here. You know, my men won't find him there. Joppa was a major seaport. This was not some little village, but Joppa was a major seaport. In fact, it's Joppa. Joppa's a very important town, as we look through the Bible, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. But Joppa's the place where the cedars of Lebanon were shipped when Solomon was going to build his temple. Joppa was the seaport that the cedars of Lebanon were shipped when they built the second temple. And so Joppa was a place that had significance long before the time of Peter and Cornelius, but was a major seaport at this time that we find it. In fact, I don't know if people who've been to Israel have gone, but apparently there are two places that allege to be the house of Simon the Tanner. And you can go and look. One is now currently off limits because of a dispute, religious dispute, but if you're ever in Jaffa, you can go and visit that. You know, Cornelius could have said, I don't even know what this message is going to be. I'm not going to invest the time and resources in sending these men 35 miles and looking all over this town when I don't even know what you're going to tell them. And yet Cornelius answers the call in verse 7. It says, and when the angel which spake unto Cornelius was departed, he called two of his household servants and a devout soldier of them that waited on him continually. And when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. Door number one being opened is Cornelius saying, I'm going to answer the call of the Lord. I'm going to ask these men to go just as I was asked by the angel. Why did he do this? Because when the angel of the Lord asks you to do something, you do it, right? I mean, that's kind of the message we get throughout the Bible, generally speaking. When the angel of the Lord appears to people and asks them to do something, they do it. We don't see a lot of consideration or contemplation. It doesn't seem like he went through the mental gymnastics that I just went through of what things he could have come up with. It was as soon as the angel of the Lord stopped talking, he called these men in and sent them. And they left that very day and arrived in Caesarea 2 days later. Just like Saul got himself up and immediately went and found Ananias, Cornelius immediately goes and finds Peter. So that's the first door that's open. The second we find in verse 34. It says, then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. So we'll come back and fill in the gaps here. But Cornelius' men find Peter. Peter then travels up to Caesarea to go to the house of Cornelius. And in verse 34, he begins to preach to him Jesus. In verse 43, it says, to him give all the prophets witness that through his name whosoever believeth in him shall receive remission of sins. And so Peter preaches to him the gospel sermon. And this knocking is God saying, obey me, believe in me, obey what I've asked you to do. And Cornelius, when this door is knocked, he could have said, whoa, I think you've got your lines crossed. I'm a devout man. I give alms to the people. I fear God with my whole house, as we read in Acts 10 and verse 2. And if you don't believe me, ask my servants. Over in verse 22, when these servants go to Peter, it says, Cornelius the centurion, a just man and one that feareth God and of good report among all the nations of the Jews. So this is a man who could have looked at Peter and said, I don't need the remission of sins. I'm a good guy. What are you talking about? I don't need to be forgiven. And yet that's not what he did. In verse 48, as Peter completes his speech there, it says, and he commanded them to be baptized in the name of the Lord. Then prayed they him to tarry certain days. And so Cornelius and his house were baptized. You know, once upon a time, another apostle was in Caesarea preaching to a government official and giving to him the gospel story, much like Cornelius received here from Peter. We find that account over in Acts chapter 24 and verse 25, when Paul was in Caesarea in the hands of Felix. And in Acts chapter 24 and verse 25, as Paul completes his speech, it says, and as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. A different government official, hearing a word from a different apostle in Caesarea, says, I'm not answering that door. I'm not going to believe and obey as God has asked me to. Cornelius heard the knock of the Spirit and answered and open the door. And so that's the second door I wanted to talk about. And I started with this one because this shouldn't wait until 2024. It's 6:31 on December 31st of 2023. And if you hear the Spirit knocking on your heart, open it now. This is not something we'll wait until 2024. I looked this up. There are on average about 8,700 people who die on December 31st. 8,700 people woke up this morning and will not see Ryan Seacrest and the ball drop on New Year's Eve. Don't assume that there'll be a more convenient season as Felix believed. If you hear the Spirit of God knocking on your heart to obey him, do that tonight. And we'll not end our lesson here tonight, but I wanted to lead with that first. So the second type of door is Peter. And really I want to talk about the door of Peter's heart. In Acts chapter 10 and beginning in verse 10, we see a very interesting story. Acts chapter 10 and verse 10, talking about Peter, it says he went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, and he became very hungry and would have eaten. But while they made ready, he fell into a trance, and saw heaven opened, and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the four corners, and let down to the earth, wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. This was done thrice, and the vessel was received up again into heaven. So what's going on here? And for those of us who are younger and may not have given much thought to this, God knew that he wanted to use Peter for a very specific mission. And he knew that Peter might have some resistance to that mission. And let me talk about what that resistance was. So this food that's lowered down, the Jewish law, the Old Testament, had a whole bunch of dietary restrictions, dietary customs or requirements that listed clean foods and unclean foods. And you were to refrain from eating unclean foods. It was something that you stayed away from. And these are set forth in Leviticus. And I just want to turn over and read one. In Leviticus chapter 11, in verse 6, just to give you an idea of what this looks like, again, for those who may not have spent much time grinding through Leviticus, as it were. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 6, it says, And the hare, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. And that's how we know Elmer Fudd was not a practicing Jew. Sorry. A rabbit was something that you could not eat because it didn't meet the qualifications to be a clean animal. And so God, in this vision that Peter receives, says, Go ahead and eat these animals, Peter. And Peter says, Nope, not going to do it. I haven't done it. I've kept myself from these unclean things that I see, and I'm not going to eat. Never have and I never will type answer to God. And God calls to him in verse 15 and says, What God has cleansed, that call not thou uncommon. And he's sending a message to Peter to say, I've cleansed these things that in your mind, because of the old law and because of your customs, would be considered unclean. Those unclean things are no longer common or unclean. I've cleansed them. In verse 16, it says this was done thrice. This same thing was happening. It's hammering into Peter's head. Don't call these things uncommon or unclean. Peter doesn't understand this message. And so if you're sitting here thinking about this and wondering, okay, where is he going with this? Peter was thinking the same thing. In verse 17, it says, Now while Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he had seen should mean, behold, the men which were sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate. And so Peter here is doubting in himself what this vision should mean. In verse 19, it says, while Peter thought on the vision. So he's really thinking about this. He's struggling with this. What exactly was God trying to get across to me? In verses 19 through 20, it says, The Spirit said unto him, Behold, 3 men seek thee. Arise therefore and get thee down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. Now I want you to imagine somebody comes to where you're staying and says, Bring me out Reagan Benoit. Bring me out Jennifer Giusti Dagley. Sorry, that was, I did maiden name and married name at the same time. Bring them out. I want to talk with them. I'm from the Roman centurion's house. Bring them out. I want to talk with them. I personally wouldn't go with these people. I might not even leave the compound to go out and meet these fellows at the gate. And the Spirit, understanding this, tells Peter, don't doubt anything, go with them. Okay, so Peter's, again, trying to figure this out, and the Spirit's telling him it's okay. And then things begin to become clear. It says in verse 21, then Peter went down to the men which were sent unto him from Cornelius and said, behold, I am he whom ye seek. What is the cause wherefore you come? Why are you guys here? In verse 22 it says, and they say, Cornelius the centurion, a just man and one that feareth God, and of good report among all the nation of the Jews, was warned from God by an holy angel to send for thee into his house and to hear words of thee. To hear words of thee. They don't want Peter just to talk. They want Peter to tell them the message that God has given to him. And this was a problem for Peter. Going back to this unclean, clean thing. Peter himself describes the Jew-Gentile relationship in verse 28. He tells them, you know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. So he's describing this relationship that the Jews and Gentiles have. And it was against the rabbinical thought of the day. It wasn't in the Old Testament necessarily to refrain from meeting with Gentiles, but some of the Talmud and some of the teachings that were passed down through the rabbis' teachings and the interpretations of the old law had made it to where it was heavily frowned upon for Jews and Gentiles to get together. It was considered to be a sinful thing for Jews to get together. And I don't want to be too strong here other than to say Peter obviously thought this would be wrong. And in case you think Peter's overly selling this, think about in Acts 11, in verse 3, when Peter comes up to Jerusalem to tell them what happens. In verse 3 it says, these people who were there, the apostles and brethren, said, thou wentest in to men uncircumcised and did eat with them. And this is a problem, that Peter has gone in to uncircumcise the Gentiles and has met with them and had eaten with them. And so when Gentiles show up at the door and say, hey, we want you to preach what God's message is to us, Peter would have previously refused this request and said, I have nothing to do with you guys. Y'all are not part of the covenant relationship. I'm not going to meet with y'all. It's uncommon. It's uncomfortable. It's unclean for me to meet with y'all. And so that's the message that the Spirit is trying to get to Peter. Hey, don't view these people as common or unclean anymore. I have cleansed them through the blood of Christ. You know, it's interesting to me that there was once a preacher asked to send a message to a group of people that he believed were not worthy of that message. Over in Jonah chapter 1, and I know I've beaten the story of Jonah to a pulp before, and I'm not going to do that again for fear that I might say Welly of the Bell. So we're going to go to Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. It says here, now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. And so God comes to this messenger and says, go and preach to these people. In verse 4, or chapter 4 and verse 2, well, Jonah refuses this message, let me say that. And in chapter 4 and verse 2, he explains why he refused that message. He said, therefore I fled before unto Tarshish, for I knew that thou art a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil. And so what Jonah is really saying here is, if I went and preached to them, I was worried that they might receive your grace. Nineveh was a bad city, and we could talk about that on a separate occasion, but Jonah was really saying, I don't want you to save those people. Those people are not worthy of your salvation. And I'm worried you're going to give it to them. So that's why I didn't go and preach to them. You know, Peter has to decide whether he's going to go up to Caesarea and preach this message of salvation to a group of people that were not in a covenant relationship, that God might extend his mercy and his pardon and extend grace to them. Peter, you'll remember, was in Joppa when these men come to him. Jonah chapter 1 verse 3, Jonah, when he boards the ship to go to Tarshish, is in Joppa. And so this call to a preacher, go and preach to these people that you don't feel are worthy, comes to Jonah, and Jonah says, I'm not answering that door. Peter gets that same knock and says, I'm going. I'm going to go up to Joppa and preach this message. So I want to ask you, as we think about this door that was on Peter's heart, what door do you have on your heart? What thing do you have or do I have that prevents us from answering the call of God? Because we all have some things from time to time that we struggle with. You know, the Jew-Gentile thing was not something that was easily going to go away for the first century Christians. It's something that they struggle with for many years over feast days and circumcision and obeying the law and all the other things. And I want to ask, what biases or prejudices or just hang-ups do we have that prevent us from doing what God's asked us to do, or perhaps from having unity in the church? Okay? I'm going to say a few phrases here. I just can't give up, fill in the blank. Do you think that way? I just can't give up this thing. I just can't get over this. Perhaps it's from your former lifestyle. You know, I was raised thinking that this, or I don't think I can do that. And maybe in your heart you have said those things, but maybe we've not been honest with ourselves and realized that we've had a door there that we haven't walked through. You know, to be honest with you, I stand at Joppa every day. God has knocked on my heart and said, Brandon, you need to do something more than what you're doing. And there's something blocking you. And maybe it's not that I need to go preach to the Gentiles, because that door has been opened. But there's something else. I stand at Joppa every day. And I think some of you may as well. And I want to ask you, when you're standing at Joppa, hearing the call of the Lord to do more, to clear out your own biases or your prejudices or whatever, will we act like Jonah and leave that door closed? Or will we act like Simon Bar-Jonah and open the door? You know, Simon Peter's name was Simon Bar-Jonah. And I'm certain it was because his earthly father was Jonah. But as we think about the parallels between Jonah's mission and Peter's mission and Joppa and all the, you know, I read this and thought, it makes sense to look at it that way as well. Which Jonah will we be? The one that opens the door, or the one who says, nope, not going to do it. I can't get past that. And so I would encourage us to open the doors on our hearts that prevent us from doing what God has asked us to do, just as Peter did. The final door. Peter opens the door. Now, we've talked about this final door, but not directly. Cornelius, the second door that was available to him to open, was the gospel. And that message had to be delivered by Peter. And why is that? Hugh, again, touched on this morning. I mean, he was trampling all through this lesson. I don't know if y'all picked up on that yet, but in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 19, as he's talking about this confession of faith that flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto you, he gave to him the keys to the kingdom. And some believe that was a reference to the fact that Peter was going to open the gates to both the Jews and the Gentiles. In Acts chapter 2, Peter gives the first gospel sermon to the Jews and says, you've killed Jesus. And pricked in their hearts, they responded to that. And in Acts chapter 10, he uses those keys to open the kingdom to the Gentiles, with whom God had not had a covenant relationship. And so Peter was the one who was called for that mission. And so it was Peter who needed to preach that message. You may be the one who opens the door for someone. And sometimes it will look like Philip. I'm not kidding you. Sometimes it will look like Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. You talked about this morning, right? Over in Acts chapter 8. This Ethiopian eunuch, who himself was a devout man, but was a Jew, and Philip had to explain to him the teachings of Isaiah. The door was there. The eunuch knew he needed to explore it. He knew there was something more he needed to walk through, but he couldn't open it for himself. And so Philip was needed to be able to open that door for him. Or it could be like Philip with Nathanael. Now, there's debate about whether these are the same Philips, right? Because there's a Philip who's an apostle, and that's who we read over in John chapter 1. But there was also the Philip who was designated among the 7 to go out and do work. And I don't want to take a position that these were the same Philip or different Philips, but just keep in mind that one Philip had to go and explain the Bible to this person. And over in John chapter 1, verses 43 through 46, we see another Philip, or the same Philip. John chapter 1, verse 43, it says, the day following Jesus would go forth into Galilee, and findeth Philip, and saith unto him, follow me. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip findeth Nathanael, and said unto him, we have found him, of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said unto him, can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip saith unto him, come and see. So sometimes you may be the Philip who has to explain the Bible to someone, maybe have to teach or study with someone and open their eyes to what the Bible is saying. And sometimes you just have to say, you know what, just come and see. Come to church with me and just see, just listen to the study. Whatever the case is, sometimes you may be both Philips. Hey, could you come to a Bible study with me sometime? Maybe you're not the one leading the Bible study, but maybe someone else could lead it. And you may be the person who has a relationship with that person who says, come with me and let's study the Bible. Or you may be the person who says, let me tell you about Jesus and the gospel. Let me explain it all to you. Let me explain this verse or this concept to you because, it seems like maybe we have a different understanding. Philip in John chapter 1 was the right man for Nathanael. He knew Nathanael and had a relationship where he could go to him and say, come and see. And Nathanael would respond to that. If he had done what many of us have done and thought to himself, I'm not going to invite him to come hear this guy. I mean, what if he gives a bad message? What if the sermon's long or boring? Or what if the singing's a little slow as Jesus is getting up to... A lot of times we make excuses and don't open doors for other people because of our own selves. Nathanael very possibly would not have known to come Jesus, would not have come to know Jesus. Philip in Acts chapter 8 was the right man for the eunuch. The Spirit called unto Philip. And Philip could have said, that's a really deep subject. I don't know that this guy's going to understand. I mean, I got to talk about Isaiah, and I got to talk about Jesus, and I got to talk about it's just too much for me to explain to a guy traveling through the desert. He could have said, this guy's from Ethiopia. He's never going to come to church with me. Have you ever thought, I'm not going to waste my time because I don't think they'll ever come to church? Philip could have said that. And if he had, this eunuch might have been lost. And so it's important for us to think about the doors that we can open. We all have different doors that could be opened. And you might be the one person who has access to someone's door. And without you knocking on it, without you presenting an opportunity for them to open it, it'll never be opened. Make it the focus next year to do that more. Much like Naaman, another person who I've beaten into the dirt, there were a lot of people involved in the conversion of Cornelius. The Spirit came to Cornelius, but Cornelius had to send messengers who went. They inquired to find Simon the tanner's house. They come to Simon the tanner's house. They call up to Peter. Peter comes. Peter goes. Lots of different people involved to make this happen. And without one of these people, that door to the Gentiles might not have been opened. And I want you to think about how many different roles you can play. You don't have to be the gospel preacher. You don't have to be the biblical scholar necessarily to open a door for someone. Think about opportunities. Find opportunities and take advantage of them this next year. As we conclude, in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 20, perhaps the most common verse that we talk about when we talk about knocking and doors, Revelation chapter 3 and verse 20, here it says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. Tonight, Jesus is knocking. And again, if you feel that knocking, if you feel this need to have the remission of sins, I want you to answer that call and don't wait for it. We use this verse in conjunction with an initial offer of salvation, that Jesus is knocking, and if you'll accept him, you'll receive this salvation that he has offered, and certainly that's appropriate. But I want you to notice where this is in the context of this chapter. He's talking to the church of the Laodiceans. This is involved in the same letter. And so as he's criticizing and rebuking the church of Laodicea, he gives this as a postscript. I'm knocking. Open the door and I will come in. And so this message is just as poignant, just as appropriate for us to consider being applied to us today. Jesus stands at whatever the door is and knocks. For the Laodiceans, it was get some fervor. Stop being lukewarm. Become hot. Show your works that you'll be hot. I'm knocking. Will you answer? And I want you to ask yourself, because I can't ask this for you, what door is Jesus knocking on tonight for you? What door will he knock on next year? I want you to give serious consideration to that as you consider the resolutions and the year that's happened and all the things we do as we roll over a new year, give serious consideration to the doors that maybe you haven't opened for people, that you haven't opened for yourself, and allowing you to let Jesus come in and sup with you and you with him. And so this is all that I have prepared this evening. I hope it's been beneficial. If nothing else, you've got a title that you can make fun of me in 28 years for, or on whatever timeline you wish to do so. So we've discussed the invitation, how it's important for us to accept that if we're subject to the gospel call. We'd encourage you to do that tonight. Or if you need the prayers of the church for any reason, we'd ask that you come as we say.